So we've had a great day so far on the polar bear cam. We've been driving around with the Tundra buggy cam. So for those of you that might be new, there's 5 polar bear cams out here. There are 2 way out east on the Cape Tower, Cape North and South. Then there's 2 closer to us here that are fixed in location on the Tundra Buggy Lodge owned by Frontiers North Adventures, North and South Lodge. And then we also have our Tundra Buggy cam mounted right where we are, right behind us here. And we roam around all day finding out what's going on the tundra. And we've had a lot of fun today. There was a bear this morning eating a snack, probably we think a seal maybe.
Yep, looked like a seal for sure.
Okay, looked like a seal, yeah. So that was pretty neat to see. We don't always see that out here. We've seen a couple other bears wandering around. We've seen a snowy owl from a distance, and we've been watching a fox hunting for the last little bit. So it's always exciting out here on the tundra. And of course, it's more exciting today because it's Halloween. So happy Halloween. Super fun. Halloween is a big deal in Churchill. Unfortunately, we missed the big Halloween party last weekend, but we'll have a great time tonight on the actual day of Halloween. People like to go big here. The costumes are amazing in town. It's a ton of fun. And even though we'll be out here on the lodge tonight, it's still going to be a blast. But I think a lot of you have heard about Halloween in Churchill before and how it's kind of an extra special place for the kids who are trick-or-treating because, of course, in Churchill, children need to also think about polar bears while they're trick-or-treating. And they need to stay safe from polar bears, and that's a big concern. We want kids to be able to enjoy the holiday safely and have parents, you know, be okay with their kids trick-or-treating and not having to worry about bears coming into town. And so there's an incredible team, the Polar Bear Alert team in town, run by Manitoba Sustainable Development, that is adding extra patrols today, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And so I'm Elisa McCall, for those of you who haven't met me before, and I'm sitting with Jeff York, who's Polar Bears International Senior Director of Conservation and holds kind of many seats in the polar bear world, including being the chair of the Polar Bear Conflict Working Group, Human Conflict Working Group. Yep. So today we're going to talk to Jeff a little bit about why you shouldn't have to be scared of polar bears on Halloween if you're prepared, and kind of how we talk to people about polar bear safety. So thanks, Jeff, for joining us today.
Sure thing. As we like to say, even though it sounds a little cheesy, is don't be scared, be prepared.
Absolutely, yeah. You don't need to worry about those ghost bears if you're taking the right precautions. So please do send in your questions on the explore.org page. I think also Facebook, just the CAM page, and yeah, we would love to answer some questions. But I'm going to ask Jeff a few questions that I have. I guess first of all, could you maybe give a brief overview of the Polar Bear Alert Team in Churchill and what their job is?
Sure. So Churchill is unique around the Arctic in that the province here invests quite a bit of resources in having 24/7 professional conservation staff available to keep the town safe from polar bears. That's a big resource investment, both in terms of people, but also in terms of money that they use for this program. And it's also unique in how they do it. So there are other polar bear patrol programs in some Arctic communities that do the first step. They put people out just kind of around the town, keeping their eyes and ears open, and responding to calls or radio calls from community members when they see a bear or have a bear near town. Here they take it up several notches in that they also have helicopters based here in Churchill, and they have the ability during daylight hours to respond to polar bear incidents, both on the ground but also by air. They have the capability to actually catch bears, both from helicopter, and then they also have a number of what are called culvert traps or bear traps. So they can set these up in areas where, you know, they don't really want bears to come any further than this spot. And if a bear is looking for a treat, it might get a trick and get a little bit of a ride in a trap to the edge of town and released. And then they take it one step yet further, and that they're the only place in the Arctic that has a holding facility for problem polar bears. So bears that are either repeat offenders, bears that perhaps don't respond the way one would expect them to towards a human or conservation officer who's trying to haze them, they often get picked up and put in holding, the penalty box, if you will, for up to 30 days. And then they're actually flown out of town and released well outside of Churchill. Hopefully, they'll work their way back out to the shore, get on the ice, and won't come back to town.
Hopefully, for sure. So the first question we have is, what is the most bears you've seen at one time?
Oh. I would say the most bears I've seen at one time was probably in the order of 35 or 6, and it was while still doing work for the USGS in Alaska around the community of Kaktovik. And it's a fairly unique spot there where Inuit people that live in that community still go out and take bowhead whales for subsistence. And bowhead whales can weigh up to a ton a foot and be upwards of 50 to 60 feet in length. So they're massive baleen whales. And you can imagine once you process an animal that size, there's a bit left over. Bears have figured this out, and they come back and hang out and take advantage of that whale meat and remains.
Yeah, that would bring a lot of bears to the yard.
It does. They see upwards of, it could be anywhere down to 30 up to 70 or 80 bears at one time in the direct vicinity.
That's amazing. So that is a little different than what we see here.
That is.
Yeah, so the bears are here right now because they're waiting for sea ice, and we do see them congregate together. And we do see, how many have you ever seen out here on the tundra, do you think?
I think at once, the most I've seen is 5 or 6. It's one thing we start to see as it's getting colder right now and the sea ice is starting to slush up. Some bears will start to push up and even bunch up on the shoreline, and you'll see in some places like Cape Churchill, groups of male bears, 4, 5, 6 male bears all piled together on the same kelp bed, just kind of hanging out.
Wow, pretty neat stuff. So why do polar bears look white if their fur is actually transparent?
Good question. I think it's the look white that's part of it, and it gets into the physics of optics and how we see things, but it's just a reflection of, or how they reflect light back to us, I guess would be the simple way to put it.
Yeah, it's a pretty neat thing, and because they do reflect light, when there's a sunset or sunrise and nice colors in the sky, the polar bears often pick that up in their fur and look really pretty. But we also see, you might see some more yellowish tinged bears out here when their fur gets oily and they're a little bit older sometimes. They do have a bit of an orange tint to them. They're not always beautiful white clean bears.
Out on the sea ice, they're very fastidious. They have access to snow and water. They're pretty good at cleaning up after themselves. The bear we were watching this morning that was eating probably a seal, probably a ring seal, as soon as he was finished, took a little snow bath, rolled around, and looked pretty clean again. Yeah,
it really did work to clean the blood out of the fur. That is kind of a good Halloween thing, I think, actually. Very appropriate for today. So here's kind of an interesting question. If kids were to drop candy on Halloween, would it attract bears?
Potentially, yes. And I think even worse in a sense than attracting a bear, it rewards a bear. And that's what we're really concerned about on the management side is, if you think about it, like the town of Churchill here, or your town, or your cabin, we're attractants. We smell interesting. We're different from other things that are out on the landscape. And bears are curious. They're highly curious. So even if it's not a food smell, it's an interesting smell or a different smell. But what we really don't want to have happen is for there to be any reward. As you can imagine, making a living out here in this environment is tough. So if bears can find an easier way to make a living, they're going to take it, or they're going to be more likely to take it. So once they get rewards, and a few pieces of candy probably isn't going to be sufficient to change a bear's whole worldview, but if it got into, say, a bag of dog food or some high-calorie garbage, then that bear could become a real problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Would you be able to tell people a little bit about what the conflict working group is and your role in that?
Sure. So in 1973, the polar bear range countries, which we also call the range states, all came together and signed an agreement on the conservation for polar bears. And at the time, that was driven by serious concern around overharvest. Overharvest not by local communities, but by sport and commercial hunters that have been going on for decades, largely unregulated and in some cases underreported or unreported. So the range countries came together. They really dealt with that quite well in different ways, but at the end of the day, they put in management schemes to make sure hunting wasn't going to be a problem for polar bears into the foreseeable future. What they didn't expect was a warming climate and melting sea ice. So in recent years, they've started to meet again, going back to 2009. They decided a low-hanging fruit, if you will, is trying to minimize or attempting to eliminate negative polar bear human conflict and definitely death related from polar bear human interactions. And so they formed the conflict working group. And we're really trying to take this on at the international level, make sure we're sharing information, best practices, make sure we're collecting the same kinds of data from the same kinds of incidents, and then we're just starting to track that data to look at it over time and see what, if anything's changing.
Right. And have you found anything with the data so far?
We have. The first analysis just came out this last year, and there were quite a few things of interest from kind of differentiating polar bears from their brown and black bear cousins here in North America, at least, and sort of the incidents we looked at. So polar bears were much more likely to have attacks happen in towns, inside communities, where with brown and black bears that tends to happen out on the land, you know, in the backcountry. They're much more so. We didn't see polar bears defending carcasses or people being around polar bear prey, I think is a bigger issue there. We didn't see moms with cubs bothering people by and large. It was mostly juvenile bears, mostly juvenile males, teenage males, and mostly bears in poor condition. And poor condition seemed to be sort of an overarching driving force. Once a bear gets skinny and is kind of hurting to make a living, it becomes a very different bear behaviorally.
Oh, interesting. Let's take a few more questions. Have you ever seen them hole hunting for seals? So I guess hunting, waiting by a seal hole?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And polar bears are such amazingly patient hunters that they will sit at these holes for hours, if not days. And we've come in during capture work with a noisy helicopter and fly right over and hover over these bears that are hunting, and it takes them a while to decide they want to move on because they've got a pretty good spot there.
Were polar bears once black many years ago?
Going way back, we know that polar bears diverged from a common or shared ancestor with brown bears. So they would have had darker fur, and they still do have dark skin underneath that white fur.
Yeah, black skin and white fur. Oh, clear fur. Very cool. What is a tundra? Is it like a snow desert?
It is a desert, in a sense. That's a good observation. So up here where we are, we're right on the edge of where the boreal forest kind of transforms into the tundra. As you go just a little bit further north of here, you're all tundra up towards Nunavut and the community of Arviat just up bay here. But the tundra is an area that gets very little rainfall. And even though it looks like it from pictures at times, you think, oh, well, there's a lot of snow there. There's really not. As far as annual snow, the snow just doesn't melt and it blows around. So you can get pretty good sized drifts. In Churchill this last year, we had a drift that essentially covered our house, one-story house.
Yeah.
So those drifts can become quite a problem. But it's not because it snowed that much in Churchill. It's just all the snow in northern Manitoba got trapped in Churchill.
I think there was little fox prints on the roof of our house that was able to climb up and down in the middle of Churchill. So that's pretty neat. Why would polar bears get 30 days in the holding facility? Is there a reason for that amount of time?
There is. So years ago, and things have changed, so whether this is still the right amount of time is kind of up for discussion with managers at Sustainable Development. But back in the day, 30 days was plenty long enough for the bay back behind us here to freeze up, or at least have begun to freeze up. And typically once there's ice on the bay, all the bears are trying to get back out there. And so it just allowed time for the bears to stay out of trouble, let them out, there's going to be some ice, and they'll bugger off.
Okay. And how far away can a polar bear smell a person, do you think?
Polar bears scent, another good question. The bottom line answer is we don't know for sure. We have implied information we get from following polar bear tracks. So when we're out trying to catch bears, we largely do it by finding tracks and then following the tracks, sometimes for hours and hours. But every now and then you'll have tracks that are very linear, stretching out across the horizon, and you'll see a sudden 90-degree turn in one direction or the other that then goes to a seal kill.
Cool.
So in that way, we've been able to say polar bears can at least smell a kilometer or two for seals and things like that. And that's going to depend too, what's the wind doing? How strong is it blowing? Which way is it blowing?
Yeah, and there's some recent research out earlier this year that showed polar bears will actually, if they can, walk crosswind, so almost perpendicular to the direction of the wind, because then they're getting all these different air streams, rather than just if they went straight onto the wind, they would get air from one direction. But by walking across it, they get all these different air streams, and then that makes sense if they would turn 90 degrees. Maybe they pick up something and head directly there. But again, the
Definitely.
wind has to be right, so.
Oh yeah, and that's a question too. It goes the same for eyesight and the same for hearing, that we're reaching out to our captive partners. So there are certain things that we can't really research very well in the wild. We can only go so far. You know, how polar bears smell is definitely one of those. And so teaming up with our zoo partners, we hope to have a much better understanding of polar bear smell soon.
Yeah, which would be great. So are there any defenses around Churchill other than bear traps?
The primary defenses here, and this is true of most northern communities, is our eyes and ears, is people seeing or detecting polar bears around. And that's worked relatively well for a long time. Do bears get through? Absolutely. You know, at where we stay in town every year, we see bears near the houses that we own or rent. We've seen bears on people's porches.
Yeah.
In town, and it's that quick response of the polar bear alert team to move those bears along and make sure nobody gets hurt. But there is no fixed fence system or electric fence system around town, because in the north, and I think this is true in a lot of communities, people are always coming and going. They're out on their skidoos, they're out on their quads, they're out walking, and they don't really want to be hemmed in by a fence.
So if you were walking and you did come across a polar bear, I guess either, in town or just outside of town, what should somebody do?
Well, the first thing before you go for a walk is to make sure you have some non-lethal or less lethal deterrents. And a great one is everybody's favorite, bear spray. And we've long been having discussions with people in the north, more so than elsewhere, about bear spray and this idea that it doesn't work on polar bears. But it does. We have now, I think, 17, and it sounds like we might have added a couple of more recently, so we might be up to near 20 incidents where pepper spray has been deployed on polar bears very successfully. People walk away, bears walk away. Now, the bear might walk away rubbing its eyes and nose, but it walks away and it's fine shortly thereafter.
Yeah, really important stuff.
Yeah.
So we hear things, sometimes people will say, well, wave your arms and play dead, but we know that there's more effective ways to deal with polar bears if one's approaching you. Getting your deterrent ready is a big one, but what else can people do to make sure they stay safe?
Yeah, you definitely need to have a plan and have an understanding of polar bear behavior. So if you live in polar bear country, or if you're visiting in polar bear country, reach out to people who live there, reach out to the resource managers responsible. Up here at Sustainable Development or Parks Canada, they've got fantastic safety resources to give you a little more information there. But in that incidents too, and this will be covered in those brochures and the bear safety information, if you're doing something like this, one, does it really mean anything to the bear? And two, where are your hands relative to your bear spray or your air horn or your banger pen? Your hands are up in the air and they're not where they need to be. So when you see a bear, the first thing you need to do is prepare that deterrent. Start thinking about your plan. If you're walking in town, you're going to go to the first store, the first house, and get inside, or a car, if that's available. You're going to try to back yourself out of that situation, let the bear do what it wants to do.
Definitely. Thank you. So this is a great question. What is being done to protect polar bears with the threat of global warming? So the best way to protect polar bears is to protect their sea ice habitat, and that is going to mean a large-scale decrease in our use of fossil fuels. When we burn fossil fuels like oil and gas for things like transportation or heating and cooling our homes, we release carbon emissions into the air. And carbon emissions act like a heat-trapping blanket. And in regular amounts, this is okay, keeps us warm. But we are burning rampant amounts of fossil fuels and thickening our heat-trapping blanket. And so we're just making the earth too warm, and when it's too warm, ice melts. And so if the global community can work together over, the next years, like now and then into the future, to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and switch to solar and wind, that will help protect polar bears. But we also need to look more immediately, because even if we make big changes now, we are still going to see declines in sea ice in the near future. And so these are some things that we can do to help polar bears, is look at mitigating these conflict issues. As sea ice declines and we see more polar bears on land, communities are going to be struggling with that, and so are polar bears. So what sort of things can we do in that sense for polar bears?
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic to those of us that work and manage polar bears, in that the threat they face now is very different from the historic threat of harvest or other typical threats of habitat fragmentation due to roads or things that are also pretty easily manageable. This one's global, and so in a sense, one of the best things that can be done to protect polar bear habitat is happening through the Paris climate agreements, well outside of the polar bear realm. But like Elisa was saying, there are a lot of other things we can do that fall into the bin of classic wildlife management. You know, reducing conflict and unnecessary killing of bears is, you know, top line among them. We want to keep bears around as long as we can, so we don't want to take them unnecessarily there. We also want to protect known key habitats, so places that we know are important for polar bear reproduction in particular. We really need to make sure we're not adding to stress in those areas, and that those bears are protected during the denning season in particular.
Right. And one of those places is Wapusk National Park.
It is.
Where the Cape Cams are, which you might see, that area in particular is not necessarily for denning, but just south of there, more into the park, it's one of the best denning areas in the world. And right now Parks Canada helps protect that area, and they do a great job. So Jeff, have there been any physical changes in the polar bear since global warming became a factor?
There have been, and it depends on where in the Arctic. So I think it's important to realize when we talk about changes to polar bears or changes in population size, it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. The Arctic is huge in size. The regions, the different subpopulations are very different ecologically. They're very different in terms of their productivity. And so we're seeing climate impacts unfold at different rates and different ways across the Arctic. But one thing we have seen in places where populations have dropped is a change in the stature and body condition. So both adult bears are getting smaller, and you can imagine as your nutrition starts to drop, you see this with other species, including humans, you're just not able to become as large as you might otherwise be, and you're also not as successful in reproducing or having cubs.
Thank you for that. So how tall, standing on its back legs, can an average polar bear be?
Well, we have a good measurement tool here in the buggy that we're on. So the back deck rail of buggy 1 is about 12 to 14 feet off the ground, I think.
BJ's nodding, yeah.
Yeah, around that area. And a mature adult male polar bear can stand up, and his paws, when he's reaching up, are right there at that 12, 13 foot level. And that's without jumping or anything.
Yeah.
So they can be quite tall when they're mature adults.
Definitely. That is so tall. And it's kind of a fun question. Do polar bears ruin any Halloween decorations that are put up?
I'm sure they do.
I'm sure they would, yeah, if they look good. Hopefully they never get close enough to do that.
Right.
But some of them look pretty fun.
Yeah, definitely. Like Elisa said, Halloween is probably one of the, knock on wood, safest times in Churchill, because they do bring in a lot of extra staff, and they also bring in volunteers from the community to be extra eyes and go to some extra effort too before it gets dark on Halloween night to sort of clear the area of bears or be very aware of where there might be a few bears.
Definitely.
So they put a ton of effort into keeping the town safe tonight for the kids to go around and trick-or-treat like the rest of us do.
Absolutely. And in Halloween-type fashion, one of the places they also patrol is a graveyard in Churchill, the graveyard that is kind of on the edge of town, and it's right where polar bears would walk through pretty easily, and I think BJ has spent some time helping polar bear patrol a few years ago, camped out at the graveyard there. It's very spooky, but it's a nice way to help keep the town safe. What subpopulation is most at risk right now?
That's a good question. And again, because we're seeing habitat changes in different areas at different times, and because there are differences in productivity as well, it makes it a more complicated answer. So we've seen some of the most dramatic, if you will, worse sea ice loss in the Barents Sea. So over by Norway, Greenland, and I always have to think of Russia differently, Western Russia, there as far as my geography. But some recent work by Jan Ars and our Norwegian colleagues suggests that population may still be stable, but more broadly. And so, and we're seeing similar things in the Chukchi Sea, where we've seen dramatic sea ice loss, recent, but it's also a very productive system in a way similar but different in terms of the animals that live there, to the Barents Sea. Both very productive marine systems, both experiencing a lot of sea ice loss, but both being, the impact of that loss seems to be buffered a bit by the productivity very different from the Beaufort Sea, southern Beaufort Sea, very
Okay.
different from Hudson Bay, where we are seeing drops in population sizes, and we are seeing that those other factors I mentioned as far as reduced adult size, reduced body condition, and decreased cub survival.
Okay. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about the Frontline Operators Workshop, or FLOW, and why Polar Bears International plays a role in that.
Sure. So to me, a great thing with Conflict is it's grassroots, it's community-based work. It's not going to be top-down, federal or even provincial or state governments necessarily telling people what to do. You need communities to come together and take measures because they want to and because they're interested in that. And so we worked with WWF, Government of Nunavut, Government of Manitoba, and other partners to kind of get all communities and other stakeholders in one room and just kind of talk through what people were seeing and experiencing all around Hudson Bay. So from Quebec, Ontario, Nunavut, and Manitoba, communities, tour operators, nonprofits, and government representatives, and also to start the conversation, at least, in sharing solutions and establishing priorities that are very regional. Sort of what are the biggest needs and concerns of people who live and work around Hudson Bay.
Oh, excellent. And are there similar programs in other countries? We've been focused on Churchill and the Hudson Bay area, but other countries are also experiencing rises in polar bear-human conflict. Is that right?
Yeah, around the Arctic, we're hearing from management authorities that there's just more and more encounters between people and polar bears. Luckily, most of those don't end up as attacks, but there's growing concern that they could. Especially as more bears spend longer times on shore. And so in other parts of the Arctic, Alaska, there's a regional government called the North Slope Borough that looks after the northernmost communities that kind of line from Canada just to about where it drops south again on the Chukchi side. And they have seasonal polar bear patrols. So some of that's staffed by their wildlife department, biologists. Others are just community members that have seasonal jobs going out and patrolling. In Nunavut, they have both a combination of conservation officers, which is usually one person in a community, and then some wildlife staff that try to share that load. Arviat, just north of us here, has gone a step further and been able to find some volunteers and also has some support from other nonprofits to pay seasonal people there. Russia, to me, is one of the more interesting places because of its remoteness, one, and also the logistic challenges they face in Chukotka, so the Russian Far East Arctic, and there, kind of in response to the death of a teenage girl back in 2006, the communities in the region really stepped up and said, hey, we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. So in Russia, it's all volunteer. It's all community members, and they have very little resources, so their primary tool is a 6-foot or 2-meter pole.
Wow.
That they carry, much like a shepherd's staff, and they just kind of use what they have available to them there. The thing they have going for them is they're all very experienced on the land and very experienced with animal behavior, so it works for them.
Okay, it works for them.
Yeah.
We're going to stick to our bear spray.
Yes.
Yeah, with any bear too.
Yeah.
That goes for brown and black bears. If you're in any bear country, we recommend the bear spray for sure. But really interesting about Russia. Hey, could you talk a bit about World Ranger Day and the award that we give?
Sure. So one thing that kind of struck us, and I think it might have been at a meeting I was at with colleagues, wildlife colleagues in Africa, but there is a group of rangers, and one of the things they do is they recognize the heroic efforts that rangers make around the world in protecting wildlife. And this originated in places largely due to threats from poaching, where rangers are actually physically harmed and sometimes killed trying to defend protected areas and protected places. But one thing missing was any recognition of the great work people do in the Arctic. And so PBI started that does exactly that. We ask for nominations around the range state countries for those who've gone above and beyond in protecting polar bears. And this year was our second year. And this year we elected to recognize the entire polar bear alert team of Manitoba for the great work they've done for a couple of decades.
Very well deserved.
Yeah.
Very well deserved. Is there a chance that polar bears will mutate and become brown to fit into a different climate? That's also kind of appropriate for Halloween.
That is.
Will polar bears mutate?
Highly unlikely. So polar bears, I think we touched on earlier, evolved from a common brown bear ancestor, but quite some time ago. We're talking 300,000 to upwards of 1 million years ago. It took a very long time for that to unfold and for them to become the sleek, long white bears we see today. It's very unlikely, given the time frame we're talking about here, with very rapid change, that they're going to be able to revert to being brown and terrestrial again.
Yeah, that takes a long time.
Yeah.
A very long time. And do polar bears really have purple tongues?
Polar bears have dark tongues. So purple to black, it depends on the light and how you look at it. But yeah, they do have dark tongues.
And maybe if they've been eating berries, it probably looks pretty purple, I'm
True.
sure. And what is the population of polar bears now? And how does that compare to about 10 or 20 years ago? So is it increasing, decreasing?
Yeah, so the best way for us to think about and to kind of gauge what's going on with polar bears isn't to look at the global population estimate, because it's not very good, to be honest. We have a lot of subpopulations where we don't have either current data or we have very little modern data at all. We have estimates, but these estimates are often sort of from combination of expert opinion, especially in Russia, and anecdotal survey information. So there are a lot of question marks in the global way, but in areas where we've been studying populations, like right here in Western Hudson Bay for over 30 years continuously. Same goes for the Southern Hudson Bay. I would say the Barents Sea, particularly around Svalbard, is probably the third best studied subpopulation. In those areas, we see very concerning trends. We've seen population declines, decrease in adult size and body condition, and declines in reproductive success.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Jeff, maybe what else can we guys talk about? So please keep sending your questions in. I would like to maybe circle back to the beginning, talking about, BJ's pointing that we have a fox on the screen, so that's pretty cute. So we'll be checking that out. So it is a red fox. That's a color morph of a red fox. And we have just seen a ton of voles and lemmings out there. It is a huge small mammal year this year. And maybe some of you saw that little clip of a polar bear grabbing the meadow vole yesterday. Super fun stuff. So we're just going to watch this fox for a bit. And we're just going to take a few more minutes here to wrap up. But Jeff, I just wanted to circle back almost to the beginning for a minute. Something we often hear about polar bears is that they are the only animal who will actively hunt and kill people. Is that true?
Absolutely not. I think any of you that are familiar with wildlife knows that there are plenty of other things out there that will look at humans as prey and potentially stalk and kill people, and do around the world. So polar bear are among many, and of the bears, of the North American bears, they actually seem to be least likely to attack and kill people. With brown bears being at the top end, black bears somewhere in the middle, and polar bears being on the lower end of the spectrum.
And so I've heard anecdotes only, but that polar bears eating at the whalebone piles that you mentioned, when a brown bear comes in, the brown bear actually intimidates some polar bears. Is that true? Which bear is maybe the stronger? Or, I mean, we need to be concerned about all bears.
Right, yeah, you should definitely respect all bears, because they're all quite capable of hurting us. We're very sensitive in that sense, or very delicate compared to a polar bear. But we know from some really good work done by some other research partners looking just at brown bears in Alaska, that they're just within the state. There's a cline, I would call it, or a trend that goes almost north to south. So coastal grizzly bears that have abundant salmon returns.
Lots of food.
Lots of food, berries, deer, tons to eat along the coast. They get quite fat and happy. They tend to be the most tolerant to other bears and to humans. When you go interior, say around Denali National Park, around Fairbanks, Alaska, with interior brown bears, a little more aggressive, a little more territorial to each other and to anything else. When you go up to the tundra, to the North Slope, where the barren ground grizzly are, what I would even call hyper-aggressive. Very aggressive bears, very territorial, very little food. So direct correlation to how hard is it to make a living. So you think about these very territorial, aggressive barren ground grizzly meeting a polar bear who's coming from a very different marine environment where there's a lot of calories, a lot of food in most years. The polar bears tend to be much more risk averse and much less territorial. So we've seen in places like Kaktovik where you'll have a number of polar bears feeding on whale. This barren ground grizzly runs in, which is a fraction of the size. They're the smallest of the brown bears. They're closer in size to a black bear.
Wow.
And the polar bears just take off.
Unreal.
Yep.
They take hangry to another level.
Exactly.
And does that have something to do with, polar bears aren't really territorial, is that correct? Because they have such large home ranges, they're not quite the same in that way to brown bears?
They have large home ranges, and if you think about where they live on the sea ice, it's always changing. It's not like it's the same valley or the same mountain range.
Right.
It's constantly in motion. If you're a polar bear, it's like living on a treadmill always.
Right. So to protect that would be...
Pretty impossible.
Yeah, totally. There's not much going on there. I'm sorry, I'm just watching the fox right behind your head there, Jeff. He's trotting along the landscape looking for some food, and I think that's a great place to wrap up. We are going to keep trundling. We're going to try to find you guys another polar bear.
Maybe a snowy owl?
Yes, we are on the hunt also for a snowy owl. We need to get some good photos of the snowy owl here. We are kind of in a great corridor for snowy owls, it seems. The last few days there's been a lot of activity, and again, the small mammal population seems really big this year. It's been really cool to see all the carnivores out here hunting those little guys.
Even polar bears.
Even polar bears. So we're going to keep finding you some great stuff. Please keep asking questions. We're in the comment section on explore.org. You can go to Facebook. We also, at Polar Bears International, we have these fantastic live chats with explore.org. We also have our webcasts for more aimed at teachers and students, and those are on our Tundra Connections page on the Polar Bears International website, but they're also played on explore.org. And we're here for, many weeks more, so please keep checking us out online and on Facebook, in the comments, anywhere. We are here to talk to you about polar bears and answer any questions you have. And thanks so much for joining us today on your Halloween. Have a great time tonight trick-or-treating or going to a party or dressing up or whatever you'd like. No one dresses up as a polar bear in Halloween. That is not really a cool thing to do, but maybe one of you will, and you can send us photos.
And if you live in bear country, remember, don't be scared. Be prepared.
Bring your bear spray.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.